She stood behind a table of perfect pies that no one would buy. The town called her a failure. They whispered cruel words and looked right through her. Hazel Boone had lost everything, her husband, her baby, and her dignity. But she was about to do something that would shock everyone. A powerful rancher walked through the crowd holding the hand of a little girl who hadn't spoken or eaten in 8 months. His daughter was fading away, and no one in this town could save her. Not the doctors, not the preacher, no one. Then Hazel knelt in the dust and held out a single cookie. What happened next would turn this entire town upside down. The whispers turned into accusations. The church ladies came for blood. And one man had to choose: protect his reputation or fight for the woman everyone said was worthless. But here's what no one expected. That little girl was about to say something that would silence every cruel tongue in Timber Ridge. This story reminds us that a person should never be judged by their sorrow, because kindness is the true food that heals the soul. Sometimes the only way to mend your own broken heart is by having the courage to help someone else. If you've ever felt invisible, unworthy, or cast aside, this story is for you. Stay until the end. And if this story touches your heart, leave a comment telling me, have you ever been judged unfairly? Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this one. The woman was Hazel Boone. She stood behind a table of 6 perfect pies that no one would buy. After losing her husband and her baby, grief had settled on her, changing her shape. The good people of Timber Ridge saw her not as a widow in pain, but as a failure. They whispered cruel words and looked right through her. So Hazel poured her sorrow into her baking, creating beautiful food that held all the love she had left to give. But excellence from an outcast was something no one wanted to see. Suddenly, the crowd parted for Clay Harlow. He was a powerful rancher, owner of a 2,000-acre spread, but now he was just a father drowning in fear. Beside him, little Leah walked like a shadow, a tiny girl lost inside her own silence. Her dark eyes saw nothing. The townspeople looked on with pity but kept their distance. They all knew the story of the accident that took her mother Rachel. They all saw the child fading away. But they did nothing, leaving the father and daughter completely alone in their grief. Hazel saw the child's profound loneliness and knew she had to act. She crossed the square, her heart pounding. She knelt in the dust until she was at Leah's eye level. Without a word, she opened a waxed paper bundle and held out a star-shaped sugar cookie. Leah's empty eyes flickered. She looked at the cookie, then at Hazel's kind face. And then she took a bite. Clay hired Hazel on the spot, a desperate move that sent shocked whispers through the entire town. At the Harlow Ranch, Hazel's quiet patience began to work a miracle. Her warm kitchen filled the lonely house with the smell of fresh bread and hope. Leah slowly started to eat again. One afternoon, while cleaning, Hazel found an old recipe book. It had belonged to Leah's mother. Tucked inside was a faded recipe for star-shaped cookies. A note read, "For my little star to make you smile." Hazel finally understood the connection she felt. It was a bond of motherly love reaching across time. At the next town fair, a happy, healthy Leah stood with Hazel. When the preacher's wife, Mrs. Talbot, made a cruel comment, Leah spoke her first public words in almost a year. "Mrs. Boone's pies are made with love," she said clearly. The town fell silent with shame. That day, Hazel and Leah sold every single pie. Soon, the ranch house was filled with laughter. Clay, Hazel, and Leah became a family. Their story reminds us that a person should never be judged by their sorrow, because kindness is the true food that heals the soul. "Baked too many," Hazel said, her voice soft as dust. "Thought you might want one." She held out a small star-shaped cookie. The noise of the market faded away. The whole world became that one simple offering. Hazel just waited, patient and still. She did not press or smile too wide. She simply knelt in the dirt and held out a cookie. Leah's hand, fragile and slow, finally reached out. Her tiny fingers closed around the treat. She took the smallest possible bite and swallowed. A flicker of something, not quite life, but close, sparked in her eyes. At that moment, Clay Harlow turned and saw them. His tough face went slack with shock, then flooded with a painful, desperate hope. He took one step forward and then froze, terrified that any movement might break the spell. Leia finished the cookie. She looked right at Hazel for the first time, her dark eyes asking a silent question. Hazel's throat went tight. She simply pulled out another cookie and offered it. The little girl took it without hesitation. That was when Clay Harlow, the hardest man in Timber Ridge, sank to his knees. "Leia," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Baby, you are eating." The whispers started then, sharp and ugly, spreading through the crowd. "Is that Hazel Boone? Feeding Clay Harlow's girl?" Cruel laughter followed. Hazel felt the familiar weight of their judgment and began to pull away. But Clay's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. "Don't," he said. The single word was enough to stop her. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with a desperate fire. "She is eating," Clay said, his voice shaking. "Do you understand what that means? She has not eaten in 8 months. His voice cracked on the words. "For 8 long months, she has been gone from us. You gave her a cookie, and she came back." He let go of her arm. "I do not care what any of these people say. If you can help her, I will pay you anything." That one word, please, broke something open in Hazel's chest. When was the last time someone had looked at her like she could fix something? She looked down at Leia, who was staring at the empty wax paper. "I can try," Hazel heard herself say. Clay's relief was a ragged sigh. "When? Tomorrow?" "I can walk over," Hazel said, needing to do this on her own terms despite the 4-mile journey. "Thank you," Clay said, and the words felt like a prayer. Hazel turned and walked back to her table on shaky legs. The whispers followed her, but for the first time in years she did not hear them. All she could see was a little girl taking one small bite and letting a little bit of light back into the world. She packed her things and drove her old wagon home, feeling something she had not felt in 3 long years: a purpose. That night, Hazel did not sleep. She stood in her small, cluttered kitchen and baked cinnamon rolls, soft biscuits, and a loaf of bread. Her hands moved with old knowledge while her mind worried. What if this does not work? What if it was just a fluke? She thought of Leia's solemn face, a child carrying a grief far too big for her. Then she thought of her own daughter. The baby she held for only 10 minutes before the midwife took her away, wrapped in a blanket, meant for a homecoming, not a goodbye. "I could not save you," she whispered into the flowery air. "But maybe, just maybe, I can help her." It was not a fix for her own broken heart, but it was something. As the sky turned gray with dawn, Hazel packed a basket and began the long walk. The 4 miles to the Harlow Ranch felt like 40. The air was sharp and cold, and the mountains rose up blue in the distance. When she finally reached the ranch gate, her feet were sore, but her hands were steady. The place was large and well kept, but it felt tired, just like its owner. The front door opened before she reached the porch. Clay stood there with Leia by his side. He looked as though he had been waiting all night. "You came," he breathed, his eyes locked on her basket. "I said I would," Hazel answered, climbing the porch steps. The house was clean, but it had no warmth. It felt like a museum to a life that had stopped moving forward 8 months ago. The kitchen was better. A fire was going and coffee was made. Hazel set her basket down and began to unpack, moving with a calm efficiency. She did not speak directly to Leia, but instead hummed a low, quiet tune, filling the heavy silence. Clay poured coffee with shaking hands, sat at the table, and simply watched, waiting for a miracle. Clay moved away, giving them space. Hazel sat and fixed a plate for herself, some scrambled eggs and a biscuit. She ate like it was the most ordinary morning in the world, paying that little girl no mind. Leia crept toward the table, her small hands gripping a chair back. Her eyes followed every single move Hazel made. After a minute, Hazel pushed a basket of cinnamon rolls to the center of the table. No words, just a simple offer. A little hand shot out, snatched a roll, and pulled it back like a hidden treasure. She took a bite. Clay made a choked sound behind her. Hazel just kept on eating her breakfast. Leia finished the roll and stared at the basket, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Hazel nudged it closer. The child took a second one, and this time she sat down. It wasn't a feast, but for a girl who had forgotten how to eat, it was everything. Clay walked her to the porch, his composure cracking. "Tomorrow?" he asked, his voice thick with gratitude and fear. "I'll pay you whatever you need." "No." Hazel's word was sharp, but she softened her tone. "This is not about money." He just looked at her, trying to figure her out. "Then what is it about?" Hazel glanced past him at Leia, who was still sitting at the kitchen table, a small, quiet presence. "It is about being hungry," Hazel said softly. "It is about remembering that eating means you still want to live." She left him standing there on his porch. He watched her walk away and thought, the whole damn town is wrong about her. And he prayed she would come back tomorrow. Her own little house was always quiet, but today the silence felt different. It felt like a pause, not an ending. Hazel went through her usual motions, taking off her shoes and putting the kettle on to boil. She sat at her kitchen table thinking about the look on Clay Harlow's face. She knew that kind of terror, the helplessness of watching someone you love just fade away. A child had eaten. It was a small thing, but Hazel had seen the hope fighting the fear in that man's eyes when Leia took that second cinnamon roll. She looked out her window at the town of Timber Ridge, a place that had judged her and cast her out years ago. But she would walk back to that ranch tomorrow, and the day after. She would walk back for as long as it took. The next morning was cold, with frost on the grass. Hazel was up before the sun, her hands already measuring flour for biscuits. The 4-mile walk did not seem nearly as long today. She was focused on the little girl waiting at the end of the road. Clay was on the porch, and he came down to take the heavy basket from her arms. "Let me," he said, his voice rough. Inside, the house felt warmer, more alive. Leia was already at the kitchen table. When she looked up at Hazel, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a silent question. "You came back." Hazel got to work, moving around the kitchen like she belonged there. Just like yesterday, she sat down and started eating her own breakfast first. It did not take long. Leia watched her for a moment, then reached for a biscuit and started to eat. When she finished, she looked right at Hazel and whispered a single, fragile word. "More." The sound hung in the air. Clay froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He set it down gently, afraid to break the spell. "Of course, sweetheart," Hazel said, her voice calm and easy. Leia took another biscuit. Clay turned away, trying to hide the tears that came to his eyes. Hazel started talking then, just quiet talk about the weather, filling the silence with something soft and normal. When Hazel stood to clear the table, Leia followed her to the sink. The little girl just stood there, a small shadow watching every move. Then Leia did something that made Hazel's heart stop in her chest. She reached out with her tiny fingers and gently touched Hazel's hand. No words were spoken, but Hazel heard the thank you, clear as day. She knelt down. "You are welcome, little one. I will see you tomorrow." When Hazel came out of the kitchen, Clay was standing in the hall, staring at the stairs where his daughter had gone. "She spoke," he said, his voice full of wonder. "She said more." Hazel simply nodded. Yes, she did. For 8 long months, little Leia had not spoken a single word. Her father, Clay, was a man hollowed out by grief, watching his daughter fade away right in front of him. The town whispered, but no one helped. Then came Hazel, a quiet baker who knew all too well what it felt like to be broken. She offered the little girl a cookie, a simple act of kindness that would change everything. This is a story about how sometimes the only way to heal your own heart is by having the courage to help heal someone else's. Hazel arrived at the ranch the next morning. Clay met her on the porch, his eyes full of a desperate hope. After just 2 days, Laya was eating again. After 4, she spoke 3 whole sentences. On the 6th day, Laya laughed. The sound was small, like a tiny bell, but it was enough to make Clay walk outside, his shoulders shaking. Hazel found him leaning against the railing. He finally turned to her, his voice rough with emotion. He said, "The doctors told me to give her time. The Reverend told me to pray, but nothing worked. I was watching my daughter disappear. Why is this different? What are you doing?" Hazel looked out over the valley. She said quietly, "You make it safe for her to come back. You do not push or demand. You just sit with her in the silence." The words hit something deep inside Clay. Hazel's own voice was barely a whisper when she added, "I know what it is like to need someone to show you it is okay to still be here." A quiet understanding passed between them. Hazel finally shared her own story, a hurt she had carried alone for 3 years. She told him about the baby girl she held for only 10 minutes before she was gone forever. "I did not know how to keep going after that," she admitted. "For a long time I was not really living. I was just not dying." Just then the screen door creaked open. Laya came out and wrapped her small arms around Hazel's waist, holding on tight. The little girl looked up and whispered, "I am glad you came back." Hazel knelt and hugged her, her own heart starting to feel whole again. "Me too, sweetheart," she whispered back. "Me too." That smile was small, but it was real, and it changed her whole face. Clay cleared his throat. He said, "I should get her dressed. We have work to do." But he just stood there watching his daughter, memorizing her smile like he might never see it again. Later, as Hazel was leaving, Clay stopped her. "Stay for lunch," he said. "Please, Leia keeps asking about you." Hazel almost said no, but then she saw little Laya in the doorway, her eyes full of hope. Lunch would be nice, she heard herself say. They made simple sandwiches and heated up some stew. Leia stood on a chair, carefully spreading butter on bread. Clay sliced vegetables with a quiet focus. And Hazel moved between them, helping them learn how to be a family again. They ate in the sunlit kitchen, and the house finally felt alive. Laya chattered about birds and cooking, her memories of her mother no longer seeming to cause so much pain. Clay just listened, really listened, learning to talk to his daughter again. After lunch, Hazel read fairy tales until Leia fell asleep in her chair, breathing soft and steady. "I will carry her up," Clay whispered, lifting his daughter with a gentle strength that touched Hazel's heart. When he came back, Hazel was getting her things. "I will drive you home," Clay insisted. "It is a long walk. You have walked 8 miles every day for a week. Let me do this for you." His tone made it clear there was no room to argue. The wagon ride was quiet for a bit, with just the sound of the wheels on the dirt road. The Texas sun was warm on their faces. "Can I ask you something?" Clay said after a while. "Why did you stop that day at the market?" "You did not know us." Hazel thought for a moment. "I saw myself," she said softly. "Not in Laya, but in you. I saw the way you looked at her, like you were watching someone you loved just fade away. I know that look. I wore it when my husband got sick, and then after he was gone." Clay nodded, his eyes on the road. "My wife, Rachel, died right in front of us. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone. Laya saw the whole thing. I think a part of her died that day too," he said, his voice thick. "The part that believed the world was a safe place. Until you came along." As they neared town, Hazel said quietly, "People are going to talk if I keep coming out to the ranch." "Let them," Clay said. "It is not that simple," she argued. "I am the town's cautionary tale. Having me around is not good for your business." Clay stopped the wagon right there in the road and turned to her. "Listen to me," he said, his voice like iron. I do not give a damn what this town thinks. Not one of them could get my daughter to eat. You did. If anyone has a problem, they can talk to me. The fierce way he protected her made Hazel's eyes sting. The church ladies will not like it, she said, trying to lighten the mood. The church ladies can go straight to hell, he replied. A real laugh escaped her, sharp and sudden. Clay almost smiled back. When they got to her little house, he helped her down. Same time tomorrow, he asked. Hazel nodded. He studied her for a moment. You are a remarkable woman, Mrs. Boone. You are more than just a good cook, and I think you know it. The next morning, a cord of firewood was neatly stacked on her porch, along with a sack of flour. No note, but she knew it was from him. When she got to the ranch, Leah ran out and threw her arms around her. I told Papa you would come, the girl cried. I will always come, Hazel promised, kneeling down to look her in the eye, as long as you want me here. Forever, Leah said, completely certain. She grabbed Hazel's hand and pulled her toward the house, chattering about a bird's nest she had found. Clay stood on the porch, watching them both. And when Hazel looked back, she saw a look on his face that was warm and full of wonder, and it made her own heart skip a beat. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm, and slowly, something began to grow between Hazel and Clay, built on shared glances, quiet moments, and the simple act of drinking coffee together in the morning. Soon Hazel was at the ranch all the time. One evening Leah said, You should just move in. I do not like it when you leave. What if you do not come back? Mama did not come back. The words hung in the air. Hazel knelt by the child's chair and took her small hands. Your mama did not choose to leave you, sweetheart. That was a terrible accident. But I'm not going anywhere. I promise. Clay watched them, his face full of emotion. Later that night, he walked Hazel to the porch. The sky was filled with stars. He looked at her and said, She is going to hold you to that promise. Hazel met his gaze. Clay then added quietly, So will I. Their small world felt perfect, like a family reborn. But this town had cruel tongues. A month later, a group of women cornered Hazel in the general store. They called her a desperate widow, preying on a grieving man. They said she had let herself go, that she was worthless. Their words were poison, and for a moment the old darkness crept back into Hazel's heart. She believed them. Just then Clay walked in. He saw the look on Hazel's face and the smug expressions on the other women. His own face hardened into cold fury. Hazel was finally feeling like she belonged somewhere, her heart just about fit to burst with happiness. That's when she saw the horses tied to the porch. They were expensive animals, the kind that belonged to folks who had strong opinions about how other people ought to live. Clay saw them too and went rigid. He put a hand on his daughter Leah's shoulder. Stay behind me, he said, his voice low. The front door swung open, and out stepped Mrs. Constance Talbot, looking like a queen. She was a tall, skinny woman in a purple silk dress that cost a fortune. Behind her stood Mrs. Emmeline Pierce and Mrs. Dorothy Ashford, their faces plastered with phony concern. Mr. Harlow, Mrs. Talbot said, her voice dripping with fake sugar. We need a word. Clay didn't budge. I'm listening. Her eyes flickered to Hazel with pure disapproval. Perhaps in private. Clay's voice was firm. Anything you have to say can be said in front of Mrs. Boone. Very well, Mrs. Talbot said, puffing up her chest. We are here to express our concern about the situation. Clay's voice turned dangerously quiet. What situation is that? This inappropriate arrangement with Mrs. Boone, she said, waving a hand toward Hazel. She's been seen here every day for a month, arriving early and leaving late, sometimes after dark. Her tone implied something shameful. Be careful, Clay cut in, his voice like iron. Be very careful how you finish that sentence. Mrs. Talbot's nostrils flared. We are only thinking of your reputation and little Leah's moral upbringing. A child needs a proper example, not... Her eyes raked over Hazel with contempt. Not a woman of questionable character who can't even control her own appetites. The insult hit Hazel like a physical blow. The old shame rose in her throat, burning worse than ever before. "That is enough." Clay's voice cracked like a whip. "You need to leave. Now." "We will not," Mrs. Pierce chirped, clutching her Bible. "Not until we've done our Christian duty." Clay let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "My daughter was fading away. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't talk. This woman," he said, moving to stand right beside Hazel, "gave her back to me. So you can keep your concerns." "Such language!" Mrs. Ashford gasped. "Leia, go inside," Clay ordered. The little girl hesitated, then ran and threw her arms around Hazel's waist. "Don't let them send you away," she whispered, trembling. "No one is sending me anywhere, sweetheart," Hazel managed to say. "It is all right." Leia looked up at her, then turned and fled into the house. The second the door shut, Mrs. Talbot's face turned cold. "We know what this is about," she said. "A lonely man and a desperate woman. She pretends to help, but soon she'll expect payment. A wedding ring. A home she does not deserve." "You don't know anything," Clay said, his voice tight with rage. "We know plenty," Mrs. Talbot shot back. "We know Hazel Boone has been the subject of scandal before. Becoming so large, her own husband likely died of shame. We know she lost a child from her own neglect." "Stop!" Hazel choked out. "My baby was stillborn." Mrs. Pierce's eyes gleamed with malice. "Or did you eat so much you smothered the poor thing?" The world tilted under Hazel's feet. "Get off my property," Clay growled, his voice barely human. "Right now." "You are making a terrible mistake," Mrs. Talbot warned. "And don't expect the decent people of this town to welcome you back." "The decent people of this town," Clay said, his voice suddenly dead calm, "stood and watched my wife bleed to death." The color drained from Mrs. Talbot's face. "You were there," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "You and your friends, praying in a circle while Rachel died in the dirt because not one of you thought to get a doctor. You were too busy performing piety to save a life." Mrs. Talbot whispered, "That is not fair." "You did not act," Clay corrected her. "And my daughter watched the whole thing. So forgive me if I don't care about your opinions on morality. Now, you will get on your horses, you will ride back to town, and you will tell everyone that Hazel Boone is under my protection. Anyone with a problem can come see me." They scrambled for their horses. Before riding off, Mrs. Talbot stared at Hazel with pure venom. "You think you have won," she hissed. "But you are just a parasite feeding on his grief. He will see you for what you are, and you will be alone and worthless again." The words were meant to break her. But then Clay stepped in front of Hazel, shielding her completely. He spoke in a soft, terrible voice. "If you ever speak to her like that again," he promised, "I will personally destroy everything you care about. Your husband's business, your standing in this town. I will burn it all to the ground." Mrs. Talbot's face went ghost white. She yanked her horse's reins and kicked it into a frantic gallop, her friends racing after her. Soon the only sound left was the quiet Texas wind. Clay stepped right in front of Hazel, shielding her. He looked at the women, and his voice was low and dangerous. He said, "You are cruel, small-minded people. This woman," he put his arm around Hazel, "saved my daughter. She brought light back into my home. She is not worthless. She is the kindest, strongest person I have ever known. And I am going to spend the rest of my life thanking her for it." He turned Hazel to face him, his eyes gentle now. "Do not you dare believe them," he said. He pulled her close, and for the first time in front of the whole town, he kissed her. It was a promise of forever. And in that moment, Hazel knew she was finally home. The three of them had found their way back to life, together. I could feel his warmth, the solid truth of him right there. He told me, "Whatever those folks made you believe about yourself, it's a lie. You hear me, Hazel? A damn lie. And just like that, something inside me shattered. For 3 years I had built walls around my heart, but his words brought them all tumbling down. I let out a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, burying my face in his shirt. Clay's arms went right around me, holding me with a kindness that made me shake. For the first time in forever, I let someone else be strong for me. As the sun set, I finally pulled back. "They'll be back," I said, my voice shaky. "They won't let this go." "I don't give a damn," he said, wiping a tear from my cheek. "You matter, Hazel, to Leia, to this ranch, to me." "I should go," I whispered, but my feet wouldn't move. "You should stay," Clay answered. "But people will talk, Clay. It will make everything a mess." "Then let it get messy," he said, his hand still on my face. "I'm tired of living by their rules. They weren't there for me when I needed them." "But you have to live here. Laia has to grow up here." "Then maybe we ought to leave," he said, the idea surprising us both. "Sell this place. Start fresh somewhere new. Somewhere folks won't whisper about her mama or treat you like dirt." "No," I said, pulling away. "This is your home. You built this ranch from the ground up. I won't be the one who makes you leave it." "You're not a reason," he said, his voice thick. "You're everything." I told him he didn't mean it, that he was just grateful. "It stopped being about gratitude a long time ago," he said, closing the space between us again. "Then what is it?" I barely whispered. His eyes searched mine. "I'm falling in love with you, Hazel," he said, plain and simple. "Maybe I already have. I know it's crazy and too soon. But when I look at you, I see my home, not the ranch. You." I couldn't breathe. "You can't," I finally managed. "I'm not the kind of woman men fall for." "And why is that?" he asked. "Because look at me." The words just spilled out. "I'm plain, and I'm broken, and the whole town knows it. Men like you marry women like your wife." "Beautiful and gone," Clay said, his voice firm but gentle. "I loved Rachel, and I always will. But you're here, Hazel. You're not broken. You're the strongest person I know. You saved my little girl. You made this house a home again. So yes, I'm falling for you, and I don't care who knows it." "I'm scared," I whispered. "Me too," he said, resting his forehead on mine. "But I'm more scared of you walking away." Just then the door flew open and Leia ran out, her face streaked with tears. "Don't go," she cried, throwing her little arms around me. "You promised forever. You can't leave like Mama did." I knelt down and held her tight. "Sweetheart, I'm not leaving. Look at me." I cupped her face, just like Clay had done to me. "I don't care what those ladies said. I promised you forever, and I keep my promises." "Even if they're mean to you?" she sniffled. "Even then, because you and your papa matter more than anything they could ever say." Laia looked right into my soul. "Do you love us?" she asked. Tears welled up in my own eyes. "Yes," I whispered, realizing how true it was. "Yes, I do." "Then you should marry Papa," she declared with perfect 4-year-old logic. "Then you'd have to live here forever." My face got hot. "Laia, it's not that simple." "Why not?" she asked. "You love us and we love you. Papa said love makes a family. So why can't we be one?" I looked up at Clay, who was trying his best not to smile. "She's got a point," he said. He knelt down beside us under the stars. "She's right. Love is what makes a family. So the only thing left to ask is..." He looked at me, his heart in his eyes. "Do you love us, Hazel?" It was the easiest and hardest question I'd ever been asked. Saying it out loud meant risking it all. "Yes," I said, my voice barely shaking. "I love you both so much it terrifies me." Laya cheered and hugged me tight. Clay took my hand in his. "Then stay," he said. "Stay as family. Let 'em talk. They can try to make it hard, but you're under my protection now. Anyone who wants to hurt you has to get through me first." "I don't need protecting," I told him. "I know," he said softly, "but I need to protect you. Let me stand between you and them. Let me be what you need." A quiet certainty settled deep in her chest. "All right," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "I'll stay. We'll figure this out together." Clay's smile was like the sun breaking over the horizon. He pulled her up with Laya between them, a small family holding on tight in the growing dark. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go into town. All of us. We are not hiding." Hazel nodded, trying to find the courage he saw in her. When a clock chimed inside, Leia let out a huge yawn. "Bedtime for little girls," Clay said, scooping her up. "Can Hazel tuck me in?" Leia asked, her voice sleepy. Hazel's heart pounded. She had never done that before, always keeping a careful distance. Tonight was different. She followed them into Leia's small room and helped the girl into her nightgown. Once Leia was settled under the quilt, she touched Hazel's face. "You'll be here in the morning?" she asked. "I'll be here, I promise." With that, Leia's eyes closed. Clay sang a soft old lullaby, and Hazel watched until the girl's breathing was deep and even. In the hallway, the air was warm between them. "Thank you," Clay said quietly, "for staying, for being brave enough to let us love you." Hazel leaned against the wall, feeling the day's weight. "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified." "Being scared and doing it anyway," he said softly. "That is the definition of brave. I know this is a lot to ask, but whatever happens, we are with you, all the way." Tears she had not cried in 3 years burned her eyes, but these felt different. They felt like hope. "I should go home," she said, not meaning it. "Stay," he whispered. "Please. The spare room is ready. I would rest easier knowing you were close." She knew it was scandalous, the kind of gossip Mrs. Talbot would feast on. But Hazel found she just did not care anymore. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." He showed her to a simple, clean room down the hall. "If you need anything," he started, lingering at the door. "I will be fine. Thank you, Clay." He nodded, but then turned back. "Hazel, I meant it. All of it. I am falling in love with you, and I do not aim to stop." Before she could answer, he was gone. Hazel sat on the bed, her heart racing. Tonight, in this house that was starting to feel like a home, she felt loved. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But for tonight, this was enough. She woke before dawn, confused for a moment by the smell of pine and leather. Then yesterday flooded back. She found Clay in the kitchen, staring into a coffee pot like it held all the answers. He looked up, his expression softening. "You are up," he said. "Could not sleep." Hazel moved toward the stove's warmth. "Me too." He poured 2 cups, and their fingers brushed as he handed one to her. "We do not have to do this," he said gently. "No," she replied, holding the warm mug. "You were right. Hiding only gives them power. And Laya needs to see that loving each other is not something to be ashamed of." His eyes searched her face. "You really mean that? About loving us?" "I do not say things I do not mean. I am learning that about you," he said, moving closer. His hand gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her face. "I was worried I had pushed too hard, scared you off." "You did not scare me," Hazel admitted, "but I am terrified." Just then, the patter of small feet came from upstairs. Leia appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide. "You stayed," she breathed, as if it were a miracle. "I stayed." Hazel opened her arms, and the little girl ran right into them. The three of them made breakfast together, moving around each other like they had done it 100 times. Leia chattered about town for a moment, forgetting the trouble from yesterday. But Hazel remembered. And as she got ready, she looked in the mirror. She saw a plain woman in a worn dress, the very person this town had already dismissed. How could today be any different? "You look fine," Clay said from the doorway, Leia at his side. "I look like someone they will tear apart," she said, her voice low. "You look like a woman worth fighting for," he said, crossing the room to take her hand. "And I am a damn good fighter." The wagon ride was quiet. Hazel felt Clay's hand resting near hers on the seat. Timber Ridge rose up on the horizon, looking like Judgment Day itself. The Saturday market was buzzing with people who would soon be staring, whispering. Clay stopped the wagon at the edge of the crowd. "Last chance to change your mind," he said, his voice steady. We got to the market, and Clay helped me down from the wagon, his hands steady on my waist. Then he lifted Leia down. The little girl took both our hands, making a chain of the three of us as we walked in. The talking stopped cold. Heads turned. Women pulled their children closer. Mrs. Talbot, holding court by the vegetables, stared at us with pure fury in her eyes. "Keep your head up," Clay murmured beside me. We only made it about 20 feet before the whispers started, like snakes in the grass. "Shameless. That poor child. Heard she spent the night." Leia's hand squeezed mine. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't understand the words. I wanted to turn back to shield her from it all, but Clay just kept walking straight ahead. We went into the dry goods store, and Mr. Simmons, the owner, just stared at us, frozen behind his counter. Have you ever felt the sting of a whole town's judgment just for trying to do the right thing? That's where Hazel Boone found herself. A good woman treated like an outcast. But she wasn't alone. This story is about how one man, Clay Harlow, stood up to a sea of whispers to defend the woman who saved his little girl. It proves that a person's true character is worth more than idle gossip. Inside the general store, the moment Clay told the nervous shopkeeper, Mr. Simmons, to put Hazel's baking supplies on his account, the air went still. A woman named Eleanor Hutchkins muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Some people have no shame." Clay turned, and his voice was low and dangerous. He looked right at Mrs. Hutchkins. "Say that again," he invited. When she repeated her insult, his fury was cold as ice. "What reputation is that? The one where she saved my daughter's life?" He took a step closer. "You will not speak about my late wife, Rachel. You didn't know her when she was alive, and you don't get to use her memory as a weapon now. Hazel Boone is worth 10 of you." He guided Hazel and his daughter Leia out of the store and into a crowd of waiting eyes. The preacher, Reverend Talbot, stepped forward. He started talking about propriety and setting an example for young Leia. His wife, Mrs. Talbot, stood nearby with a smug smile on her face, enjoying the scene. The Reverend meant well, but he was worried about what people were saying. "Mr. Harlow," he began, "people have concerns." Clay cut him off. "Concerns?" His voice boomed across the town square. "You want to talk about examples? When my wife died, my daughter stopped talking, stopped eating. This town brought casseroles and offered prayers while she faded away. You did nothing that mattered. But this woman," he said, pulling Hazel close, "this woman everyone is so quick to judge, gave my daughter back to me. She did what none of you could." Just then, little Leia's voice cut through the silence from the wagon. "Papa," she asked, her eyes wide, "why are they being mean to Hazel?" That one simple question shamed the entire crowd. Clay helped Hazel into the wagon and drove away, leaving the town standing in stunned silence. It just goes to show, true decency is about how you act, not what people whisper about you. Mr. Talbot looked like he had been struck. His wife's smile vanished. The whole town square seemed to hold its breath, watching a pack of adults corner a woman who had only been kind to a little girl. Clay set his daughter down and knelt to her level. He said, "Sometimes, darling, folks get scared of what they don't understand, and that fear turns them mean." "But Hazel is nice," Leia said, her voice small. "I know she is. So why are they not nice back?" A child's truth cuts deep. Hazel's eyes burned watching the little girl try to make sense of it all. Leia turned to the crowd, her face far too serious for her age. "Hazel stops me from being sad about my mama," she announced clearly. "She helps me want to eat and play again. If y'all are mean to her, you are being mean to me, too." The words hit the crowd hard. Shame crept across several faces. But Mrs. Talbot found her voice quick enough. "Child, you are too young to understand," she said, her voice slick as oil. "Your father is making choices that will hurt you." Leia's chin lifted. "What choices? Letting Hazel live with us? I asked her to." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. "Well now, isn't this something?" Mrs. Talbot said, her eyes shining with victory. "Living in sin right in front of a child. You have truly hit a new low, Mr. Harlow." "She stayed one night," Clay said, his jaw tight. "In the guest room. It was late, and I was not sending her home in the dark." "How very convenient for you," Mrs. Talbot sneered. "I am sure it will keep being convenient until she has her hooks in you so deep you cannot get away." "That is not true," Hazel started, but was cut off. "Oh, save it. We all see what is happening here. A desperate woman using a grieving man and his little girl to trap him." "You are wrong," Leia cried out, her voice trembling with a rage Hazel had never seen. "Hazel is not mean like you are. She does not make people cry. You do. You are the mean one." Mrs. Talbot's face turned to stone. "Mr. Harlow, you had better teach that child some respect." "She is showing respect," Clay answered, his voice cold as a riverstone. "Just not to you. Just not to... You have not earned it." He lifted Leia into his arms and headed for the wagon, signaling the conversation was over. But Hazel was frozen. She knew what was coming next. She could see it all so clearly. This town would never let them be. The whispers and the judgment would follow them everywhere. They would ruin Clay's business and make Leia an outcast at school. It was all because Hazel dared to believe she could have a family. It was not right, but it was the truth. "Clay," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "put Leia in the wagon." He turned back and his face grew wary. "Hazel, please, just put her in." Clay did as she asked, then walked back to her, his eyes searching hers for an answer. "Do not," he said, his voice low. "Do not you dare." "I cannot do this to you," she said, her heart shattering with every word. "I cannot be the reason your daughter is miserable, the reason your business fails, the reason you are hated in your own town. I do not care about any of that." "Well, I do," Hazel said, forcing herself to look him in the eye. "I care about Leia being happy and safe, and that cannot happen as long as I am here." "So what are you saying?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Hazel looked past him at Leia, so small and confused in the wagon. Then she looked at the hateful faces in the crowd. "I am saying I have to go," she whispered. "I have to leave town before I ruin everything for you." "No," he said, the word flat and final. "You are not leaving. We can figure this out." "How, Clay?" Tears finally began to fall down her face. "Tell me how. They will never accept me. They will never accept us. And I will not watch them hurt Leia because of me." "She will hurt more if you leave," he said, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You have no idea what you mean to her. Walking away now will break her heart. A broken heart is better than a broken life. That is not your decision to make," he argued. "Yes, it is," Hazel said, gently pushing his hands away. "I am the adult. I know what it is like for a town to hate you. and I will not let that happen to her. She took a step back, creating a space between them. She saw the hope drain from his eyes, replaced by pure panic. "Hazel, please," he begged. "Do not do this." "I am so sorry," she breathed. Then she turned and began to walk away. Away from Clay. Away from Leia, who was now calling her name, her little voice filled with fear. "Hazel, where are you going? Papa, make her come back." Every step was agony. But this was also love. The kind of love that required sacrifice. The kind that meant putting their happiness before her own. She reached the edge of the market when Clay grabbed her arm and spun her around. The raw pain on his face almost made her give in. "You made her a promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You promised her forever." "I know," she sobbed. "Then how can you just leave?" "Because a forever with me means she will suffer. I love her too much to stay." "That does not make a lick of sense." "It is the only thing that does," Hazel said, pulling her arm free. "Go on back to her, Clay. She needs you. She needs both of us." "No," Hazel insisted. "She needs a peaceful life. A father who is not always in a fight. A chance to just be a kid. I cannot give her that." She turned and walked on, and this time he did not follow. He just stood there as she walked out of their lives, certain she was doing the right thing, even though it felt like a part of her was dying. Behind her, Leia's cries echoed through the town square. "Hazel, please, you promised!" Each word was a fresh wound. Hazel did not look back. If she saw that little girl's face one more time, she knew she would break, so she kept walking. She walked away from the only family she had ever known. She walked until the sounds of the market disappeared and her small, empty house came into view. Only then, behind a closed door, did she finally let the grief take over. The house was cold and smelled of dust. It had never felt like a home, but now it felt like a grave. She sat at her kitchen table, the same one where she had eaten alone for 3 long years. She put her head in her hands and she cried. She cried for Leia's heartbroken screams and for the look of betrayal on Clay's face. She cried for the beautiful promise she had to break, and she cried for being foolish enough to believe that a woman like her could ever find happiness. When the tears finally ran dry, she felt completely hollowed out. There, in the crushing silence, she was just a shell of a person, left with nothing but the terrible certainty that she had made the only choice she could. Have you ever had to make a choice that broke your own heart, thinking it was for the best? That was Hazel. She ran away to protect a little girl from small-town gossip, leaving behind the only family she had. But sometimes what feels right is dead wrong. The afternoon bled into evening. Hazel sat frozen at the table, the echo of little Leia's scream the only thing in her head. She had survived alone for 3 years. She reckoned she could do it again. Then a hard knock hammered on the door. It was Clay. "Hazel, open this door right now," he hollered, his voice thick with fury. Her body moved on its own, pulling the door open. He looked like he'd been through a storm. "Where is Leia?" was all she could ask. He pushed past her, saying, "She is with the Barretts. They owed me a favor." Clay paced like a trapped animal. "Do you have any earthly idea what you did today?" She wrapped her arms around herself. "I had to." "Necessary?" He spun on her. "She cried for 4 hours straight, Hazel. Just kept asking when you were coming back." The words felt like a punch to the gut. "She will adjust," Hazel whispered. "Will she?" He shot back. "The last time someone she loved just vanished, it took us 8 months to get her back. You want to be the second person to abandon her? I am not abandoning her. I am protecting her." "From what? Gossip?" He let out a harsh laugh. "All you did was prove to her that everyone leaves, that she cannot trust anyone to stay." "That is not fair," she cried. "Nothing about this is fair." His voice cracked. "It is not fair my wife died. It is not fair my daughter saw it. But you running away instead of fighting is what is worse." "I cannot fight them, Clay. I am not that strong." "That is a lie," he said, grabbing her shoulders. "You are the strongest woman I know. You saved my daughter. She needs you right now, today. She needs you to come back and show her that love can stay." "But what if I make it worse for her? What if you leave and she grows up broken?" he pleaded, his voice soft now. "Hazel, I am scared too. But running away from this, it destroys her. And maybe us too." "There is no us," she whispered. "It costs her too much." "It gives her everything," he said. "A mother, a family. Your leaving does not spare her pain, it guarantees it." She knew he was right. Running away was not noble. It was just cruel. "I do not know how to fix this," she said, her voice broken. "We figure it out together," he said, taking her hand. "To heck with the town. For 8 months I cared what they thought. And all it got me was a daughter who was fading away. Then you showed up and she started laughing again. I started breathing again." Clay looked her straight in the eye. "I love you, Hazel. I know it is fast and crazy, but I do not care. We need you to come home." The image of Leia, sad and alone, was more than she could bear. "I have to go to her, right now." Relief washed over Clay's face. He pulled her toward the door, but she stopped him. "Wait. If I come back, we are doing this right. No more sneaking around. We get married." Clay just froze. "What?" "You heard me?" she said, a new strength in her voice. "If we are a family, we make it official. I want to be your wife. I want to be her mother. And I want everyone in this town to know we chose this, and we are not ashamed." Clay stared at her for a second, and then a real, honest laugh escaped him. "What is so funny?" "I was going to propose tomorrow," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band. "So," she said, a smile finally breaking through, "is that a yes?" "That is a heck yes," he said, pulling her into a kiss full of promise. "We will do it tomorrow, in front of the whole town. Wait." Clay slid the ring right onto her finger. It fit like it was made for her. "We're getting married tomorrow. Anyone with a problem can answer to me." Hazel shook her head. "You're insane." He just kissed her. "Probably. But you love me anyway." She did. She had loved him for weeks, maybe since she first offered his daughter that cookie in the dust. "I really do." "Then let's go get our daughter." They raced through the dark toward the Barrett ranch, where a warm light glowed in the windows. Tom Barrett opened the door and just gave them a nod. "She's upstairs. But fair warning, she's in a bad way." Sarah Barrett met them at the top of the stairs. "She cried herself to sleep about an hour ago, kept asking for you." Guilt twisted in Hazel's gut. Inside, tiny Leia was curled on the bed, her small hand clutching a piece of Hazel's old apron that still smelled of cinnamon. "Oh, sweetheart," Hazel whispered, kneeling down. Leia's eyes fluttered open, then her face crumpled as she launched herself at Hazel. "You left. You promised forever, and then you left." "I know, baby, and I am so sorry," Hazel said, holding the little girl tight. "I was wrong." Leia sobbed into her shoulder. "Please don't go away again. Everybody leaves." "Not anymore," Hazel promised, looking Leia square in the eye. "I am never leaving you again, ever. This time it's for real, forever." "You promise?" Leia's voice was a tiny whisper. "I promise." "And to prove it," Hazel glanced at Clay, who nodded. "Your papa and I are getting married tomorrow. That means I'll be your mama for real, and no one can ever make me leave." Leia's eyes grew wide. "A real family?" "The three of us, a real family," Clay said, kneeling right beside them. "Tomorrow," Leia whispered, a bit of excitement finally in her voice. "Can I wear a pretty dress?" Hazel laughed through her tears. "The prettiest one we can find." "And can I call you Mama?" That simple question was more than Hazel could have hoped for. "Yes," she cried. "I would love that." Leia hugged her full of pure joy. "I have a mama again, Papa." Today, Hazel was becoming a wife and a mother. The entire town would be watching, and she had to find the strength to face them. A soft knock came. "Mama, are you awake?" The words still made Hazel's heart flutter. "I am, sweetheart. Come on in." Leia rushed into the room, a happy mess of tangled hair. "Papa says we need to head to town and see the Reverend. And you have to braid my hair because Papa makes a mess of it. Can we have pancakes?" The little girl's chatter was a sweet song, proof that they were going to be just fine. "Yes to all of that," Hazel said, getting out of bed. "But first, come here." She held Leia close. "I need you to know something. When I ran off, I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong. Running away just hurts the folks you love. I promise no matter what mean things people say, I will never run away again. I will stay and fight for you." Leia nodded seriously. "Okay, and I will help fight." Hazel laughed. "That's a deal. Now about those pancakes. Their morning was a whirlwind. Hazel cooked while Clay paced. The plan was simple. Ride to town, talk to Reverend Talbot, and get married that afternoon. No big fuss, just the words to make them a family. Clay had already sent word. He was not asking for permission. He was stating a fact. The Reverend could marry them, or they would find somebody else who would. By noon they were set to go. Leia wore a blue dress, Clay his Sunday best, and Hazel a simple green dress. She had pinned up her hair, trying not to worry about the whispers and stares she would get. She looked at herself in the mirror and decided no more. She was done feeling sorry for who she was. Clay loved her. Leia loved her. That was all that mattered. The ride into Timber Ridge was quiet. As the town came into view, Hazel's stomach tightened. People would be out and about. People who had seen everything yesterday. Clay must have read her mind because he reached over and squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens," he said, "we are in this together." "Together," Hazel repeated. They pulled up to the church where Reverend Talbot stood waiting on the steps. His face was calm, but his eyes showed concern. "Mr. Harlow, Mrs. Boone, I got your message, and," Clay's tone left no room for argument, "I will perform the ceremony." The Reverend sighed. "I have to ask, are you sure about this? Marriage is a sacred thing, not something you rush into because of—" He glanced at Leia. "Obligation." "It is not obligation," Clay said, his voice firm. "It is love. Are you going to marry us or not?" The Reverend looked from one to the other, then seemed satisfied and nodded. "All right, but we are going to do this proper. Give me 1 hour. We will have the ceremony right here in the church with witnesses." "We do not need witnesses," Hazel began. But the Reverend held up a hand. "Oh, yes, you do. If I am doing this, it will be done right. Public, legal, and witnessed by this community, so no one can ever question it." It was what Hazel had both wanted and feared. A public wedding meant the whole town would see and judge them. The church was packed full of whispering folks. Mrs. Talbot sat right in the front, her face a mask of disapproval. Ranch hands, shop owners, and the town gossips were all there. Hazel froze. "Why are they all here?" "I sent word," Reverend Talbot said softly. "These are your neighbors, for better or worse. Give them a chance to see that this is real." Clay's hand tightened on hers. "We can still go." "No." Hazel took a deep breath. "He is right. If we are raising Leia here, we do it in front of them all. We show them we have nothing to be ashamed of." She started walking down the aisle, holding Leia's hand with Clay by her side. The whispers got louder. Someone, maybe Mrs. Pierce, made a disgusted sound. But Hazel kept her eyes fixed on the front of the church. They reached the altar and turned to face each other. Clay looked both nervous and determined, his eyes so full of love it took her breath away. Leia stood between them, grinning, not noticing the tension in the room at all. The Reverend began, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The familiar words calmed Hazel. She focused on Clay's face, on the way he looked at her. When it was his turn for the vows, his voice was clear and strong. "I, Clayton Harlow, take you, Hazel Boone, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part." Hazel's own voice shook, but she made it through her vows. When the Reverend said, "You may kiss the bride," Clay pulled her close for a soft, sweet kiss. And that is when Mrs. Talbot stood up. "This is a travesty," she announced, her voice cutting through the peace. "Reverend, you have blessed a union built on sin. This woman has trapped a good man using his grief and his child." The church fell silent. Clay turned to face her, looking dangerous, but Reverend Talbot held up his hand. "Mrs. Talbot, I have heard all the town gossip, but for the last month, I have watched this family." He looked right at her. "I have seen a man come back from the dead. I have seen a little girl heal from hurt we all thought was permanent. I have seen love win. So no, this is not a travesty. This is grace. But she is, Mrs. Talbot sputtered, gesturing at Hazel, "not appropriate." "She is exactly appropriate," the Reverend said firmly. "She is kind and selfless, and she loves this family with her whole heart. Those are the things that matter, not her dress size or where she comes from." "You are making a mistake," Mrs. Talbot hissed. "It will not." Clay's voice was quiet but final. He pulled Hazel and Leah close. "Because we chose this. All three of us. We chose to be a family, and nothing you say can change that." He then looked at the crowd. "I know some of y'all think I am making a mistake, but when my daughter was sick, this woman saved her. When I was lost in sorrow, she gave me a reason to live. While this town gossiped, she was the only one who helped. So yes, I married her. And I would do it again tomorrow." Leah tugged on his sleeve. "Papa, can I say something?" Clay lifted his daughter up for everyone to see. The little girl looked out at the crowd. "You were all mean to my mama," she said. "A few people looked ashamed. She tried to help me, but you said bad things. She came back for me anyway. Now she's my real mama forever. So if you want to be mean to her, you have to be mean to me too." The simple truth from a 4-year-old girl hit harder than any argument. Hazel could see it on their faces, shame, and maybe even a little regret. But Mrs. Talbot just grabbed her things and stormed out of the church with a few other ladies following behind her. The Reverend watched them go. "Anyone else care to leave?" he asked calmly. No one moved. "Good," he smiled. "Then I would like to introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. Clayton Harlow and their daughter, Leah. May we all learn a little something about grace." A few people started clapping, and then a few more. It was not everyone, but it was enough. It was a start. Clay kissed Hazel again, a long, happy kiss. "We did it," he whispered. "We did," Hazel agreed, and for the very first time she believed they were truly going to be all right as they walked back down the aisle together. The next morning, a small crowd gathered to watch them become a family. Tom Barrett shook Clay's hand. "You made the right choice." Sarah hugged Hazel and said, "Welcome to the family." Not everyone approved, of course. There were plenty of cold shoulders and whispers. But enough good people showed up to matter. That evening, the three of them had a simple dinner back at their ranch. Clay handed Hazel the deed to the land, giving her everything she never dared to want. "Thank you," she whispered, "for fighting for me." "Always," Clay said, and kissed her softly. "Always and forever." The months that followed were not always easy, but their life together grew stronger. Hazel's pies started selling again at the market, and Leah was happy in school. Then one spring morning, about a year later, Hazel knew something was different. She found Clay waiting for her by the barn, his face full of concern. She just smiled. "I am pregnant." Pure joy lit up his face as he spun her around, laughing with tears in his eyes. Leah ran out from the house. "Mama's having a baby." "Yes, sweetheart," Hazel said. "You're going to be a big sister." That Sunday in church, Clay stood up, proud as could be. "We are expecting a baby," he announced to the entire town. After the service, Sarah Barrett squeezed Hazel's hand. It is all worth it, is it not? Yes, Hazel said, looking at her family. It always is. Hazel admitted she thought Clay was crazy for taking on a grieving man and a silent child. He faced down the whole town to make them a family. That night, as they planned for the new baby, Clay saw her fear. "Are you scared?" he asked. She could only nod, remembering the daughter she lost. Clay pulled her close. "This time is different," he promised. "You have me and Laya. You are not alone." As winter settled in, Laya spent hours talking to Hazel's growing belly. On a clear December morning, their son was born, healthy and howling. Hazel held him and cried, but this time her tears were pure joy. "He is perfect," Clay whispered. They named him Thomas, to honor a past that did not need to be forgotten. When Laya met her new brother, she touched his tiny hand. "I will protect him forever," she vowed. "Just like Mama protected me." Later that night, Clay wrapped his arms around Hazel as she watched the snow fall outside. "Happy?" he asked her. She leaned back into him, into the life and family that had saved her. "Yes," she said. The house that had been filled with sorrow was now a home. They had proven that sometimes broken people can find each other and build something whole. Against all odds, some promises get to last forever.